There is a stage in human awareness that most people never reach, not because they cannot, but because they refuse to pay the price it demands. It is the moment an empath stops mistaking emotional intensity for connection, stops confusing familiarity for loyalty, and stops calling emotional dependency friendship. And when that shift happens, something unsettling begins to unfold. Because awakened empaths don't become more social, they become more silent. Not empty silent, but precise silent. Selective silent. Dangerously aware silent. And suddenly the world they once tried to belong to starts feeling like a performance they were never meant to audition for. You begin to notice something most people never admit out loud. The people you called friends were not bonded to you. They were bonded to how you made them feel about themselves. And the moment you stop over-giving, over-explaining, over-caring, the bond doesn't weaken. Awakening for an empath does not begin with noise, celebration, or recognition. It begins with a quiet internal fracture in perception, a moment where what once felt emotionally meaningful starts to feel emotionally questionable. The same conversations that used to create warmth now feel repetitive, scripted, and strangely empty underneath the surface tone. You begin to notice that people are not actually connecting with you. They are interacting with the version of you that reflects back what they need in that moment. And that realization does not arrive as a thought. It arrives as a sensation in the body, a subtle withdrawal of emotional investment that cannot be consciously controlled. You are still present, still listening, still responding, but something inside you has stopped participating in the illusion of depth where none exists. What makes this shift so destabilizing is that empaths are trained, not by instruction, but by repetition, to equate emotional intensity with emotional truth. If something feels strong, it is assumed to be real. If a conversation carries emotional charge, it is assumed to be meaningful. If someone expresses vulnerability, it is assumed to be intimacy. But awakening disrupts this entire framework because perception becomes sharper than reaction. You start to see that emotional expression is not the same as emotional honesty. People can cry and still manipulate. People can speak softly and still distort reality. People can show concern and still be entirely self-referential. And once that pattern is seen clearly enough times, your internal system stops responding to surface emotional signals as proof of depth. This is where the first separation begins, not from people, but from illusion. You are still physically present in conversations, still socially engaged, still participating in relationships, but your nervous system is no longer fully invested in the outcome of those interactions. You begin to observe instead of absorb. You begin to listen for structure instead of content. You start noticing how often conversations return to self-interest, how rarely curiosity is mutual, how frequently emotional exchange is uneven without acknowledgement. And what once felt like natural social flow begins to look like patterned emotional economy, where attention is currency and validation is the hidden transaction. At this stage, something subtle but irreversible happens. You stop over-explaining yourself, not because you are hiding, but because you realize explanation does not increase understanding in people who are not actually listening for truth. You stop over-giving emotional context to those who only use fragments of it to build their own narrative. You stop attempting to emotionally bridge gaps that others have no intention of crossing. And in that withdrawal, relationships begin to shift without warning. Some people become distant, not because you changed, but because your emotional availability no longer fills their expectations automatically. What feels like loss is actually recognition. You begin to see that many connections were maintained not by mutual depth, but by your emotional labor. You were the interpreter of moods, the stabilizer of tension, the absorber of discomfort, the one who kept conversations alive when they would have naturally ended. And when that function is no longer performed unconsciously, the relationship reveals its actual structure. Some bonds collapse immediately, not because they were strong and lost, but because they were dependent on your unconscious participation. That collapse feels like rejection at first, but over time it becomes unmistakably clear that what disappeared was not connection, but dependency. The most difficult part of this awakening is not the absence of people, but the absence of emotional predictability. You can no longer assume that care is consistent, that attention is reciprocal, or that presence implies depth. Every interaction becomes something you assess internally rather than something you surrender to emotionally. This does not make you colder, it makes you more precise. Emotional signals are no longer accepted at face value. They are filtered through pattern recognition. You begin to understand that consistency is rare and that most relational behavior is reactive rather than intentional. As this clarity deepens, your standards shift without effort. You no longer seek people who are exciting, intense, or emotionally expressive in bursts. You begin to notice that those qualities often mask instability, not depth. What you begin to value instead is emotional coherence, behavior that aligns across time, silence that does not punish, presence that does not fluctuate based on internal mood swings. But this kind of stability is not common, and so your social world naturally contracts. Not because you are pushing people away, but because fewer interactions meet the threshold of emotional integrity that your awareness now detects automatically. At the same time, your tolerance for performative connection decreases dramatically. Small talk feels heavier, not because it is meaningless, but because you can now see how often it replaces real presence. Social engagement begins to feel like watching people act out versions of themselves that are designed to be accepted rather than understood. And while you may still participate, something inside you no longer confuses participation with belonging. You are there, but not absorbed, present, but not entangled, engaged, but not emotionally dependent on the outcome. This is where most people misunderstand the shift. From the outside, it looks like withdrawal. From the inside, it is refinement. You are not rejecting connection. You are rejecting distortion. You are not avoiding people. You are avoiding emotional misalignment. You are not becoming isolated. You are becoming selective in a way that no longer compromises internal stability for external inclusion. And that selectivity begins to remove entire categories of interaction that once felt necessary for belonging, but now feel unnecessary for survival. What emerges in its place is a quieter form of awareness, one that does not seek constant emotional stimulation. You begin to notice that solitude is no longer uncomfortable in the way it once was. It stops feeling like absence and starts feeling like recalibration. The internal noise that used to come from managing multiple emotional inputs begins to settle. And in that settling, perception becomes sharper, not because more is happening externally, but because less distortion is being processed internally. Over time, you realize that the awakening was never about losing friends in the traditional sense. It was about losing the illusion that emotional proximity automatically equals emotional truth. It was about seeing that most social bonds are sustained by unspoken agreements to avoid depth that might disrupt comfort. And once that avoidance is no longer unconscious, the entire structure of connection begins to reorganize itself around authenticity rather than familiarity. What most people call losing friends during an empathic awakening is not an event of abandonment. It is an exposure of structure. It is the moment when emotional systems that were previously invisible become undeniable, and what held relationships together without awareness begins to dissolve under awareness. The pain that follows is not the loss of people themselves, but the collapse of meaning that was incorrectly assigned to those connections. Because when you have spent years interpreting inconsistency as complexity, emotional absence as independence, and occasional care as deep loyalty, the mind builds a narrative that feels stable until perception sharpens enough to remove the illusion holding it together. At the beginning of this shift, there is often confusion rather than clarity. You remember moments of laughter, shared vulnerability, emotional exchanges that felt real at the time, and you try to reconcile those memories with the present absence of reciprocity. But what you are actually confronting is not contradiction in people. It is inconsistency in pattern. You are seeing, perhaps for the first time without emotional distortion, that the same individuals who once felt deeply connected to you were only ever available in fragments, in emotional windows that opened and closed according to their internal state, not according to mutual commitment. And when those fragments are no longer enough to sustain your engagement, the bond does not weaken gradually, it simply stops being reinforced. This is where the internal shift becomes irreversible. Once you recognize that your emotional effort was the stabilizing force in many relationships, you can no longer participate in them unconsciously. You begin to see how often you were the one maintaining continuity, initiating repair after distance, interpreting silence in a generous way, and adjusting your emotional expression to preserve harmony. And in doing so, you were not building mutual connection. You were compensating for emotional absence. But because that compensation was consistent, it created the illusion of stability, and that illusion was interpreted as friendship. When the empath awakens, that compensation mechanism weakens, not intentionally, but structurally. Your nervous system stops offering automatic emotional regulation for others. You stop filling silence that was never yours to fill. You stop translating emotional ambiguity into reassurance. And what happens next is not conflict, but disappearance. Some people slowly fade, not because anything was directly done to push them away, but because the invisible support system they were relying on is no longer active. And without that support, the connection has no independent structure to sustain itself. This is why awakened empaths often experience what feels like sudden social emptiness. But it is not sudden in reality. It is simply revealed in contrast. The relationships were always dependent, but the dependency was hidden beneath interaction frequency, emotional intensity, or shared history. Once those surface layers are no longer enough to override perception, the underlying imbalance becomes visible. And what becomes visible cannot be unseen, regardless of emotional attachment or memory association. The most difficult realization within this stage is understanding that emotional closeness does not guarantee emotional reciprocity. You can be deeply invested in someone's inner world while they are only partially invested in yours. You can remember details, hold emotional context, and maintain continuity while they engage only when it is convenient or emotionally comfortable for them. And when you finally see this imbalance without distortion, you also see that many of your strongest emotional bonds were not mutual at all, but asymmetrical systems where you provided depth and they provided intermittent presence. What makes this realization painful is not the behavior of others, but the recognition of your own pattern of participation. You begin to understand that your empathy often functioned as a bridge over relational gaps that were never repaired by the other side. You normalized emotional inconsistency by attributing it to stress, personality, or circumstance, when in reality, it was a lack of investment that you repeatedly compensated for. And because you were emotionally adaptive, you made instability feel sustainable, which allowed relationships to continue far beyond their natural capacity. As awareness deepens, emotional withdrawal is often misinterpreted by others as change in personality, but internally, it is actually the cessation of overfunctioning. You are no longer managing emotional tone for the group. You are no longer anticipating emotional needs before they are expressed. You are no longer interpreting silence as something that requires your intervention. And in the absence of that constant emotional labor, many relationships lose their functional anchor. Not because you became distant, but because you stopped performing the role that held the dynamic together. This creates a paradox that most people do not understand. From the outside, it appears that the empath is becoming isolated, but from the inside, what is actually happening is a redistribution of emotional responsibility back to where it originally belonged. And when others are no longer unconsciously supported in this way, their level of engagement often decreases, revealing that their presence was conditional on emotional convenience rather than genuine connection. There is also a deeper layer to this dissolution. As your sensitivity increases, you begin to detect emotional incongruence with greater accuracy. You notice when words and behavior do not align. You sense when attention is present, but awareness is absent. You recognize when empathy is being performed rather than felt. And this constant perception of mismatch creates a natural disengagement, not from people themselves, but from the experience of relational inauthenticity. You are no longer able to merge into interactions that require self-deception to feel meaningful. Over time, what remains is a quieter internal landscape. The emotional chaos that once came from managing inconsistent bonds begins to fade. You are no longer constantly adjusting your internal state to match external unpredictability. And while this reduction in emotional stimulation may initially feel like loss, it gradually reveals itself as stabilization. Because what you are no longer experiencing is not connection, but emotional volatility mistaken for connection. This is where the misunderstanding of no friends becomes most distorted. It is not that awakened empaths are incapable of friendship. It is that they are no longer compatible with relationships that rely on emotional imbalance. The pool of people who can engage without dependency, inconsistency, or unconscious extraction of emotional labor is significantly smaller. And so the social circle contracts not because connection is rejected, but because distortion is no longer tolerable. In this state, absence of unnecessary relationships does not create emptiness in the way it once would have. Instead, it creates internal space that was previously occupied by emotional management. And within that space, perception becomes sharper, thought becomes quieter, and self-reference becomes stronger. You are no longer constantly orienting yourself around others' emotional states. You are no longer fragmented across multiple relational obligations. You are no longer internally divided between what you feel and what you must manage for others. And what once felt like losing friends is eventually recognized as something far more precise: the removal of emotional systems that required self-abandonment to maintain their continuity. What emerges after emotional clarity strips away illusion is not detachment from people, but detachment from dependence. This is the point where the awakened empath stops unconsciously negotiating their self-worth through relationships and begins to recognize something far more fundamental: that emotional stability cannot be outsourced without cost. For years, the internal system was trained to treat connection as regulation, meaning that proximity to others was mistaken for internal balance. If people were present, you felt regulated. If they withdrew, you felt destabilized. If they validated you, you felt real. If they misunderstood you, you questioned yourself. And without noticing it, your entire emotional equilibrium was being governed externally rather than internally. Sovereignty begins when that external governance collapses, not in a dramatic rejection of people, but in a quiet withdrawal of dependency loops that once operated automatically. You no longer check emotional signals to determine your internal state. You no longer wait for response to confirm your value. You no longer interpret silence as threat or attention as proof of belonging. Instead, there is a growing internal continuity that does not fluctuate based on external presence. And this continuity changes everything about how relationships are experienced. At first, this shift feels unfamiliar because the nervous system has to relearn how to exist without constant relational feedback. For a long time, connection was not just social, it was regulatory. It told you when you were safe, when you were valued, when you were seen. So when that external feedback is no longer required, the system initially interprets it as absence. But what is actually happening is reorientation. The emotional center of gravity is moving inward, and that movement feels like isolation only to a system that was previously dependent on external validation for stability. As sovereignty strengthens, something subtle but powerful begins to occur in perception. You stop reacting to emotional presence and start evaluating emotional consistency. You are no longer impressed by intensity, expression, or familiarity. You begin to look for alignment over time, not emotional peaks in isolated moments. This shift removes a large portion of previously compelling connections from significance, because many relationships are built on emotional spikes rather than sustained coherence. And once coherence becomes the standard, most interactions no longer qualify as meaningful. This is where emotional independence becomes visible to others, even if it is never spoken. You become less reactive in conversations, less urgent in response patterns, less emotionally negotiable in moments of tension. And people who were accustomed to your emotional availability often interpret this as distance or change in affection. But internally, it is not distance from them, it is distance from automatic self-abandonment. You are no longer collapsing your emotional state to maintain relational comfort. You are no longer adjusting your truth to preserve emotional equilibrium in others. And that absence of adjustment is often more disruptive than any explicit boundary. What is often misunderstood is that sovereignty does not reduce empathy, it removes compulsion. You still understand people deeply, still sense emotional undercurrents, still recognize unspoken dynamics, but you are no longer obligated to carry them. You are no longer responsible for regulating emotions that are not yours. You are no longer merging so completely into others that you lose internal separation. And this separation creates clarity, not coldness. You can see more without absorbing more. You can perceive more without being pulled into emotional entanglement. Over time, this creates a completely different relational experience. Instead of entering relationships to complete emotional needs, you begin entering them from a state of internal sufficiency. You are no longer seeking someone to stabilize your internal world. You are observing whether mutual stability can exist without collapse into dependency. And this subtle reversal changes the entire structure of connection. Relationships are no longer places where you go to find yourself. They become spaces where you observe whether authenticity can coexist without distortion. As this internal stability deepens, emotional manipulation becomes easier to detect. Not because you are looking for it, but because you are no longer emotionally entangled in ways that obscure perception. You can sense when emotional expressions are being used to influence rather than to communicate. You can recognize when vulnerability is being leveraged instead of shared. You can feel when attention is being used as a substitute for accountability. And because you are no longer emotionally invested in maintaining every connection, you do not need to rationalize these patterns to stay connected. You simply observe and adjust distance accordingly. This is where the idea of having no friends becomes profoundly misunderstood. It is not the absence of connection, it is the absence of compulsory connection. It is not loneliness, it is freedom from emotional obligation that was previously mistaken for loyalty. And once that obligation is gone, the remaining relationships become significantly fewer, but also significantly clearer. There is no longer confusion about where you stand, because you are no longer interpreting inconsistency as complexity or inconsistency as depth. The internal experience of sovereignty is also marked by a reduction in emotional urgency. Situations that once would have triggered immediate internal reaction now pass through without destabilization. You are no longer pulled into emotional escalation by others' moods or expectations. There is space between stimulus and response that did not exist before. And in that space, choice replaces reaction. You are no longer compelled to respond in ways that maintain harmony at the cost of self-alignment. You can pause, evaluate, and choose whether engagement is even necessary. This is often where awakened empaths begin to appear different to others, not because they have changed their personality, but because they have removed automatic emotional compliance. They are no longer predictably available in every emotional moment. They are no longer default participants in every relational dynamic. And that unpredictability is often misread as detachment, when in reality it is discernment. Engagement is no longer automatic, it is intentional. As sovereignty stabilizes further, even solitude changes meaning. It is no longer experienced as absence of connection, but as absence of distortion. The internal environment becomes quieter, not because something is missing, but because unnecessary emotional processing has stopped. There is less internal conflict between self and expectation, less fragmentation across relationships, less emotional residue from interactions that required excessive interpretation. And in that clarity, identity becomes more continuous, less fragmented, and more anchored in internal reference rather than external reflection. Eventually, what remains is not isolation, but precision. Fewer relationships, but clearer boundaries. Less emotional noise, but greater perception. Less dependency, but greater stability. And in this state, connection is no longer measured by frequency or intensity, but by coherence, mutual respect, and emotional integrity that does not require self-abandonment to maintain. And from that place, interaction is no longer a search for belonging, but a choice made from wholeness rather than lack.